Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern scandal, a single decision would tear apart the very fabric of royal unity. When King Charles made a choice that would silence an entire family forever, he unknowingly set in motion events that would shake the monarchy to its core. This is not just another royal tale of duty versus desire. This is the untold story of how one moment of decisive action created a rift so deep that it would redefine what it means to be royal in the 21st century. What happens when the weight of a crown becomes heavier than the bonds of marriage? When protocol trumps personal loyalty? When a king must choose between the woman he loves and the institution he serves? The answer lies in a silence so profound that it echoed through every corridor of the palace, changing everything forever. Prepare yourself for a story where love, power, and family collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about modern royalty. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon in a palace is not a sword or a decree, it's silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as King Charles stood at his study window, watching the distant figures of his security detail patrol the grounds. It was Tuesday, October 15th, and the autumn air carried with it the weight of decisions that would soon reshape his reign forever. What he didn't know was that within 72 hours, his relationship with his wife's family would be permanently altered by a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. Camilla had been queen consort for 18 months now, and the transition had been smoother than anyone in the royal household had dared to hope. The British public, once skeptical of the woman who had been labeled a homewrecker decades earlier, had gradually warmed to her genuine warmth and unassuming manner. She possessed a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life, whether she was visiting a cancer ward or attending a state dinner with foreign dignitaries. Her infectious laugh had become a familiar sound in the palace corridors, bringing a lightness that had been absent for years. But behind the carefully orchestrated public appearances and the polished royal engagements, tensions had been brewing within the Parker Bowles family that would soon explode into the open. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, had always maintained a respectful distance from the royal spotlight. As a successful food writer and critic, he had built his own career independent of his mother's royal connections. His sister Laura, an art gallery director, had similarly carved out her own path in the creative world. Both had attended Charles and Camilla's wedding in 2005, but had consistently declined to take on any official royal duties or titles. The problems began in late September when Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband and the father of her children, made what palace insiders would later describe as an extraordinarily poor judgment call. Despite their amicable divorce years earlier, Andrew had maintained cordial relations with both Camilla and Charles. He was a retired British Army officer with an impeccable service record, and his military connections had always been viewed as an asset rather than a liability. However, his decision to write a tell-all memoir about his life, including intimate details about his marriage to Camilla and the early years of her relationship with Charles, sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. The book proposal, titled Duty, Love, and the Crown, My Life with Camilla, had been submitted to several major publishing houses without any consultation with the palace or even with Camilla herself. Word of the project reached the king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, through contacts in the publishing industry who felt obligated to alert the royal household about the potentially explosive content. The manuscript reportedly contained detailed accounts of private conversations, family gatherings, and personal insights into the dynamics between Charles, Camilla, and the late Queen Elizabeth II during the transition period. What made the situation particularly delicate was the timing. The royal family was still navigating the aftermath of Harry and Meghan's various public statements and media projects, and the last thing they needed was another family member airing private matters in public. The manuscript allegedly included Andrew's observations about Charles's relationship with his sons, Camilla's initial struggles to find her place within the royal hierarchy, and behind-the-scenes details about how the family dealt with public criticism and media scrutiny. Charles learned about the book on a Thursday afternoon during his weekly briefing with his private secretary. The king's face remained impassive as Sir Clive explained the situation, but those who knew him well could see the tightening around his eyes that indicated his growing anger. For Charles, who had spent decades carefully managing his public image and protecting the privacy of his family, the prospect of having intimate details of his personal life exposed by someone he had trusted and welcomed into his circle was nothing short of betrayal. The king's immediate concern was not just for his own privacy, but for Camilla's well-being. He knew how deeply she valued her family relationships, and how devastating it would be for her to discover that her ex-husband was planning to profit from their shared history. Charles had always admired Camilla's ability to maintain positive relationships with her former spouse and his family, viewing it as a sign of her emotional maturity and generosity of spirit. The thought that this trust might be exploited for commercial gain filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. Over the next several days, Charles found himself consumed with thoughts of how to handle the situation. His first instinct was to have his legal team issue cease and desist orders, but Sir Clive warned him that such aggressive action might only generate more publicity for the book and create the impression that the royal family had something to hide. The king also considered having a private conversation with Andrew, appealing to his sense of honor and his past military service to convince him to abandon the project. However, initial inquiries through intermediaries suggested that Andrew was committed to moving forward with publication. The situation became even more complicated when intelligence reached the palace that Tom and Laura Parker Bowles were apparently unaware of their father's book project. This meant that any action taken by the royal family could potentially drive a wedge between Camilla and her children, who might feel caught in the middle of a conflict they had not initiated. Charles found himself facing a strategic nightmare where every possible course of action seemed to carry significant risks for his family's stability and public reputation. As the weekend approached, Charles made the decision to confide in Camilla about the situation. He had initially hoped to resolve the matter quietly without involving her, but the complexity of the family dynamics made her input essential. The conversation took place on Saturday evening in their private sitting room at Highgrove House, away from the formal atmosphere of their London residences. Charles had rehearsed what he would say, but when he saw Camilla's face fall as he explained Andrew's plans, all his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. Camilla's initial reaction was one of complete shock. She had always believed that Andrew respected the boundaries they had established around their shared history and their children's privacy. The idea that he would write about their marriage and her relationship with Charles without even discussing it with her first was something she found almost impossible to comprehend. As the full implications of the situation began to sink in, her shock transformed into a deep sense of hurt and betrayal that Charles had rarely seen her display. The Queen Consort spent the rest of the weekend in a state of quiet contemplation, declining to join Charles for their usual Sunday morning walk around the estate grounds. Instead, she remained in her study, making phone calls to close friends and family members to gauge their opinions about how to proceed. Charles respected her need for space, but found himself increasingly frustrated by his inability to take decisive action while the situation remained unresolved. By Monday morning, it became clear that the story was beginning to leak to the media. Several royal correspondents had started making inquiries about rumors of a forthcoming book by Andrew Parker Bowles, and it would only be a matter of days before the full story became public. Charles knew that once the media got hold of the story, his options for managing the situation privately would disappear entirely. The turning point came during a Tuesday morning meeting between Charles, Camilla, and their senior advisors. The group had assembled to discuss possible responses to the Andrew Parker Bowles situation, but the meeting quickly evolved into a broader conversation about how the royal family should handle challenges from within their extended circle. It was during this discussion that Charles made a statement that would later be remembered as the moment when his approach to family relationships fundamentally shifted. "We cannot continue to operate under the assumption that family loyalty will always take precedence over personal ambition," Charles told the assembled group, his voice carrying a note of finality that made everyone in the room take notice. If someone chooses to prioritize their own interests over the dignity and privacy of this institution, then they must accept the consequences of that choice. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, and even Camilla seemed taken aback by the hardness in her husband's tone. Charles had always been someone who preferred negotiation and compromise to confrontation, but the Andrew Parker Bowles situation had apparently pushed him past his limits of tolerance. The king's advisors exchanged meaningful glances, understanding that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in how the monarch intended to deal with family challenges going forward. What none of them realized at that moment was that Charles had already begun formulating a plan that would extend far beyond just dealing with Andrew's book. The king had concluded that the entire Parker Bowles family represented a potential ongoing source of instability and embarrassment for the monarchy, and he was prepared to take dramatic action to neutralize that threat permanently. As the meeting concluded and the participants began to file out of the room, Charles asked Camilla to remain behind for a private conversation. The queen consort had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, and Charles wanted to ensure that she understood the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences of the decisions that would need to be made in the coming days. "Darling," Charles began, taking Camilla's hands in his own, "I need you to understand that whatever happens next, it's not going to be easy for any of us. But we have a responsibility to protect the monarchy, and sometimes that means making choices that feel personally painful." Camilla looked into her husband's eyes and saw a resolve that both impressed and frightened her. She had always known that Charles took his duties as king seriously, but she was beginning to realize that his commitment to protecting the institution might require sacrifices that she had never fully contemplated. The woman who had spent years believing that love could overcome any obstacle was about to discover that sometimes duty demanded a price that love alone could not pay. Wednesday morning brought with it the kind of gray, drizzling rain that seemed to seep into the very stones of Buckingham Palace, creating an atmosphere of foreboding that matched the mood within its walls. Charles had spent a restless night, his mind churning through various scenarios and their potential consequences. By dawn, he had reached a decision that would alter the course of his reign and permanently change the dynamics of his family relationships. The king's first call was to Sir Clive Alderton, summoning his private secretary for an emergency meeting before the normal start of the official day. When Sir Clive arrived at the king's study at 7:30 in the morning, he found Charles already dressed and seated behind his desk, surrounded by papers and looking as though he had been awake for hours. The private secretary had worked with Charles for years and had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods. But the expression on the king's face that morning was unlike anything he had seen before. "Clive," Charles began without preamble, "I need you to arrange a meeting with Tom and Laura Parker Bowles for this afternoon. Tell them it's a private family matter that requires immediate attention and that their presence is non-negotiable. I don't want any intermediaries or representatives present, just them, myself, and Camilla." Sir Clive raised an eyebrow at the unusual request. In his experience, formal meetings with extended family members were typically handled through more diplomatic channels, with careful preparation and clear agendas established well in advance. The king's insistence on immediacy and the exclusion of advisors suggested that something significant was about to unfold. "Might I ask about the nature of the discussion, Your Majesty?" Sir Clive inquired carefully. "It would help me frame the invitation appropriately." Charles stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the rain-soaked courtyard. For a long moment, he was silent, and Sir Clive wondered if the king was reconsidering his approach. When Charles finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the private secretary understand that this was not a request for advice, but a directive to be executed without question. "Tell them that we need to discuss the future relationship between the Parker Bowles family and the royal household," Charles said, still not turning around. "Tell them that recent developments have made it necessary to establish new boundaries and expectations. And, Clive, make it clear that this is not a social invitation. This is a formal meeting that will have lasting consequences for everyone involved." Within hours, the carefully worded invitations had been delivered to Tom and Laura Parker Bowles, both of whom were reportedly surprised by the formal tone and urgent timing of the request. Tom had been in the middle of preparing for a restaurant opening in Edinburgh, while Laura was coordinating a major exhibition at her gallery in London. Neither had any knowledge of their father's book project, and both assumed that the meeting was related to some upcoming royal engagement or charity initiative that might involve the extended family. Camilla spent the morning in what her personal staff described as a state of unusual agitation. The queen consort was typically known for her calm demeanor and ability to handle stressful situations with grace, but the prospect of the afternoon's meeting had clearly affected her deeply. She canceled her scheduled visits to a local hospital and a community center, citing a minor illness, but those close to her understood that she was struggling to prepare herself emotionally for what was to come. The queen consort's relationship with her children had always been one of the most important aspects of her life. Unlike many members of the royal family, who often maintained formal relationships with their offspring due to protocol and public scrutiny, Camilla had managed to preserve the close, affectionate bonds she had established with Tom and Laura during their childhood. They regularly spent time together away from royal events, shared inside jokes and family traditions, and provided her with a sense of normalcy that helped her cope with the pressures of her public role. The thought that she might need to choose between her loyalty to Charles and the monarchy versus her relationships with her children was something that Camilla had never seriously considered. She had always assumed that her family would naturally adapt to her royal responsibilities and that any conflicts could be resolved through open communication and mutual understanding. The realization that she might not have control over the outcome of the afternoon's meeting filled her with a dread that she struggled to conceal. Meanwhile, intelligence about Andrew Parker Bowles's book project continued to filter in through various channels. The palace's media monitoring team had identified several publishing industry insiders who were discussing the manuscript, and the consensus seemed to be that it contained genuinely explosive material about the royal family's private dynamics. One source suggested that Andrew had included detailed descriptions of conversations he had witnessed between Charles and his sons about Harry's decision to leave his royal duties, while another indicated that the book contained unflattering portrayals of how various royal family members had treated Camilla during her early years as Charles's companion. Perhaps most damaging were the reported revelations about the late Queen Elizabeth II's private opinions about Charles's relationship choices and her concerns about the stability of the monarchy during the transition period following her death. Andrew had apparently been present during several family gatherings where these topics were discussed, and his outsider's perspective on the royal family's internal dynamics provided insights that no previous royal tell-all had been able to offer. The legal team's preliminary assessment was that the palace would have limited options for preventing publication, particularly if Andrew could demonstrate that his accounts were truthful and that he had not signed any formal confidentiality agreements. The book's potential commercial success was also likely to attract significant media attention, creating a publicity nightmare that could overshadow the king's official duties for months. As afternoon approached, Tom and Laura Parker Bowles arrived at Buckingham Palace within minutes of each other, both looking puzzled by the mysterious nature of their summons. Tom, a cheerful man in his late 40s with his mother's easy smile and approachable manner, had dressed in a conservative suit that he hoped would be appropriate for whatever formal occasion awaited him. Laura, elegant and artistic like her mother, but with a more serious demeanor, wore a simple black dress that conveyed both respect and professionalism. The siblings were escorted to a private drawing room that was typically reserved for sensitive family discussions. The space was smaller and more intimate than the grand reception rooms where official business was usually conducted, but it still maintained the formal atmosphere that reminded visitors of the institutional power that surrounded them. Neither Tom nor Laura had spent significant time in this particular room, and both felt slightly intimidated by the elaborate furnishings and historical portraits that seemed to watch them from every wall. Charles and Camilla entered the room together, but their body language immediately signaled to the visitors that this was not going to be a routine family gathering. The king walked with the measured pace he typically reserved for state occasions, while Camilla appeared unusually tense and avoided making direct eye contact with her children. The formal greeting that Charles offered, a slight nod rather than his usual warm handshake, set a tone that made Tom and Laura exchange worried glances. "Please, sit down," Charles said, gesturing toward two chairs that had been arranged facing a sofa where he and Camilla took their places. The physical arrangement reinforced the sense that this was an official proceeding rather than a family conversation, and both Tom and Laura began to understand that they were about to receive news that would not be welcome. Charles began by expressing his appreciation for their discretion regarding family matters over the years and acknowledging the respect they had shown for Camilla's royal responsibilities. He praised their professional achievements and their decision to maintain independent careers rather than seeking to profit from their royal connections. The formal language and ceremonial tone of his remarks made it clear that these were preliminary observations leading to more significant statements. However, Charles continued, his voice becoming noticeably cooler, "Recent developments have made it necessary for us to reconsider the relationship between your family and the royal household. Your father has made decisions that demonstrate a fundamental lack of respect for our privacy and for the dignity of the crown. These actions have consequences that extend beyond just his own relationship with us." Tom and Laura looked genuinely confused by this statement, and Laura was the first to speak up. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. Has my father done something that we should know about?" Camilla shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, and Charles glanced at her before continuing. Your father has written a book about his marriage to your mother and about our family's private affairs. He intends to publish this book without consulting anyone involved and, apparently, without considering the impact it might have on the monarchy or on your mother's position. The shock on Tom and Laura's faces was genuine and immediate. Neither had any knowledge of their father's literary project, and both seemed struggling to process the implications of what Charles was telling them. Tom was the first to recover his composure enough to respond. "Sir, I can assure you that Laura and I had no knowledge of any such book," Tom said, his voice carrying a note of growing concern. "If our father has written something inappropriate, perhaps we could speak with him and convince him to reconsider publication." Charles's response was swift and decisive, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. "That option has already been considered and dismissed. The very fact that your father would undertake such a project without consultation demonstrates that he cannot be trusted to act in the best interests of the royal family. More importantly, it raises questions about the reliability and discretion of your entire family." The words hung in the air like a physical blow, and both Tom and Laura seemed to recoil from their impact. Camilla remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her distress was evident to her children. The realization that they were being collectively punished for their father's actions was something neither had anticipated, and both struggled to formulate an appropriate response. Laura found her voice first, speaking with a dignity that reminded observers of her mother's grace under pressure. "Your Majesty, while I cannot speak for my father's choices, I hope you understand that Tom and I have always conducted ourselves with the utmost respect for your family and for the institution you represent. We would never do anything to jeopardize Mother's position or to cause embarrassment to the crown." Charles acknowledged her statement with a slight nod, but his expression remained impassive. "I appreciate your personal integrity, Laura, and yours as well, Tom. However, the reality is that your father's actions have created a situation where the palace can no longer afford to maintain close relationships with any members of the Parker Bowles family. The risk of future incidents and the appearance of instability are simply too great." The full meaning of Charles's words began to sink in as he continued outlining what he described as new protocols for the family's relationship with the royal household. Tom and Laura would no longer be invited to any royal events, including private family gatherings and official ceremonies. Their access to Camilla would be limited to pre-approved occasions, with all meetings subject to oversight by palace security. Most painfully, they would be asked to sign formal agreements pledging that they would never write about their experiences with the royal family or discuss private family matters with the media. As Charles detailed these new restrictions, Camilla finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tom, Laura, I want you to understand that this is not what I wanted. But we have to think about the bigger picture and what's best for the monarchy." The pain in her voice was evident, but so was her acceptance of Charles's decisions. For Tom and Laura, this was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire meeting. The realization that their mother was willing to sacrifice her relationship with them to protect her position and her husband's authority. The woman who had always put her children first was now choosing duty over family, and both siblings struggled to reconcile this new reality with the mother they thought they knew. The meeting concluded with Charles expressing his hope that Tom and Laura would understand the necessity of the new arrangements and would cooperate with the transition to a more distant relationship. He assured them that these measures were not permanent punishments, but necessary protections for the stability of the monarchy. However, the formal tone of his farewell and the way palace staff immediately appeared to escort them out made it clear that the era of close family relationships was definitively over. As Tom and Laura left Buckingham Palace that evening, both understood that their lives had been fundamentally altered by decisions that were completely beyond their control. The casual phone calls with their mother, the informal family dinners, and the sense of being welcomed into the extended royal circle were now things of the past. They had become collateral damage in a conflict they had not initiated and could not resolve. For Camilla, watching her children leave under these circumstances represented one of the most painful moments of her royal tenure. She had always believed that her family relationships could coexist with her royal duties, but Charles's decision had forced her to choose between them. The silence that followed their departure would become a defining characteristic of her relationship with her children, a void that would reshape not only her personal life, but also her understanding of what it truly meant to be queen. The 3 days following the confrontation with Tom and Laura Parker Bowles marked a transformation in the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace that was felt by everyone from the senior courtiers to the housekeeping staff. Charles had retreated into a state of cold efficiency that his advisors recognized as his response to making difficult decisions, while Camilla moved through her daily routine with a mechanical precision that suggested she was struggling to process the emotional impact of what had occurred. The first sign that the situation was escalating beyond anyone's expectations came on Friday morning when Sir Clive Alderton received an urgent call from Andrew Parker Bowles himself. The retired military officer was calling from his home in Wiltshire, and his voice carried a tone of barely controlled anger that immediately put the private secretary on alert. Andrew had apparently learned about the meeting with his children through a phone call from Tom, and he was demanding an immediate explanation from the palace about what he characterized as unconscionable treatment of his family. "I want to speak directly with Charles," Andrew declared, dispensing with the usual protocols for addressing the monarch. "What he's done to my children is completely unacceptable, and I won't stand for it. Tom and Laura have done nothing wrong, and they don't deserve to be punished for decisions I've made independently." Sir Clive found himself in the delicate position of trying to manage an increasingly volatile situation while protecting the king from direct confrontation with someone who was clearly prepared for an aggressive argument. Charles had made it clear that he did not want to engage with Andrew personally, believing that such a conversation would only provide the retired officer with additional material for his book and would signal that the royal family was open to negotiating about matters of fundamental principle. "Mr. Parker Bowles," Sir Clive responded carefully, "I understand your concerns about your children, but the palace's position on this matter has been clearly communicated. The king has made decisions based on what he believes to be in the best interests of the monarchy and the royal family's security." Andrew's response was immediate and furious. "Don't give me that institutional nonsense, Clive. This is about Charles being vindictive because I chose to write about my own life and my own experiences. He's taking it out on innocent people because he can't control me directly." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Andrew making increasingly heated accusations about the king's motives and character. Sir Clive tried to maintain a diplomatic tone throughout the exchange, but it became clear that Andrew was not interested in finding a reasonable resolution to the conflict. Instead, he seemed determined to escalate the situation and force a direct confrontation with Charles. The call ended with Andrew making a statement that would later be remembered as the moment when the dispute moved from a private family matter to a potential public relations catastrophe. "Tell Charles that if he wants to play hardball with my family, then he'd better be prepared for me to play hardball right back. My book is going to be published, and now it's going to include a full account of how he's treating my children. The British people deserve to know what kind of man their king really is." When Sir Clive reported this conversation to Charles, the king's reaction was swift and decisive. Rather than being intimidated by Andrew's threats, Charles seemed energized by the prospect of a direct confrontation. For someone who had spent decades navigating diplomatic challenges and carefully managing public perceptions, the clarity of having a defined adversary appeared to be almost liberating. "He's made his choice," Charles told his private secretary, his voice carrying a note of finality that indicated he had moved beyond anger into something more strategic and potentially more dangerous. "Andrew Parker Bowles has decided to declare war on the monarchy, and now he's going to discover what that actually means." Charles spent the weekend at Windsor Castle, ostensibly for his regular private retreat, but actually to finalize plans for what his inner circle would later describe as the most comprehensive response to a family challenge in modern royal history. Working with a small team of trusted advisors that included Sir Clive, the palace's head of security, and the king's personal lawyer, Charles developed a multi-pronged strategy designed to neutralize the threat posed by Andrew's book, while sending a clear message to anyone else who might consider challenging royal authority. The first element of the king's response involved the royal family's considerable influence within the British publishing industry. Charles had Sir Clive reach out to contacts at major publishing houses, not to threaten legal action, but to provide context about the potential reputational and commercial risks associated with Andrew's project. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Companies that chose to publish attacks on the royal family might find themselves excluded from future opportunities for authorized royal books, official biographies, and other lucrative projects that required palace cooperation. Simultaneously, the king authorized an unprecedented investigation into Andrew Parker Bowles's personal and financial affairs. Using the palace's extensive intelligence network and connections with government agencies. The investigation sought to identify any potential vulnerabilities that could be used to apply pressure on the retired officer. The legal team was particularly interested in examining Andrew's military pension, his various business investments, and any charitable organizations with which he was affiliated that might depend on royal patronage or government funding. Perhaps most significantly, Charles made the decision to extend the isolation of the Parker Bowles family beyond just Tom and Laura to include their extended network of friends, business associates, and social contacts. Palace staff began compiling detailed lists of everyone who maintained regular contact with members of Andrew's family, with the intention of making it clear that continued association with the Parker Bowles clan could result in exclusion from royal events and loss of access to the social and commercial benefits that came with royal favor. The thoroughness and systematic nature of Charles's response revealed an aspect of his character that few people had ever witnessed. The man who had always presented himself as thoughtful and conciliatory was demonstrating a capacity for strategic ruthlessness that surprised even his closest advisors. It became clear that the king viewed Andrew's challenge not just as a personal affront but as a test of his authority that would establish precedents for how he would handle similar situations throughout his reign. Camilla observed these developments with growing alarm and sadness. While she understood the institutional logic behind Charles's actions, the personal cost of the escalating conflict was becoming increasingly difficult for her to bear. Her attempts to speak with Tom and Laura had been blocked by palace security protocols, and she was beginning to realize that her husband's definition of protecting the monarchy included protecting her from the emotional complications of maintaining family relationships. The queen consort's isolation from her children was having visible effects on her public demeanor. Royal watchers began to notice that her smiles seemed forced during official engagements, and her typically warm interactions with the public had become more formal and distant. Close friends reported that she was having difficulty sleeping and was spending long hours alone in her private study, apparently writing letters that she never sent. The situation reached a new level of intensity on the following Tuesday when Andrew Parker Bowles made good on his threat to escalate the conflict publicly. Rather than waiting for his book to be published, he decided to give a television interview to a major British broadcaster, providing a preview of the revelations he intended to include in his memoir. The interview was scheduled to air during prime time on Thursday evening, and advance publicity promised shocking insights into the private behavior of senior royals. When news of the upcoming interview reached Buckingham Palace, Charles's response was immediate and unprecedented. For the first time in modern royal history, the king authorized the release of a public statement that directly addressed a personal family dispute. The statement, issued through the palace's press office, was brief but devastating in its implications. His Majesty is disappointed by the decision of certain individuals to exploit their former associations with the royal family for commercial gain, the statement read. The king has a duty to protect the dignity and privacy of the monarchy, and he will not hesitate to take appropriate measures to safeguard the institution that serves the British people. The carefully worded statement was immediately interpreted by media analysts as a declaration that the royal family was prepared to use all available resources to defend itself against Andrew's attacks. More significantly, the use of the phrase former associations was seen as a clear indication that Andrew and his family were now considered to be outside the royal circle entirely. The public nature of the palace's response sent shockwaves through British high society and the extended network of families connected to the monarchy. For generations, royal family disputes had been handled with discretion and quiet diplomacy, even when they involved serious disagreements about money, titles, or personal behavior. Charles's decision to make the conflict public represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would handle challenges to its authority. Andrew Parker Bowles' television interview, when it finally aired, proved to be even more damaging than the palace had anticipated. Speaking with obvious emotion and anger, Andrew provided detailed accounts of conversations he claimed to have witnessed between Charles and other senior royals. He described the king as vindictive and controlling, and alleged that Charles had systematically isolated Camilla from her family in order to ensure her complete loyalty to royal interests. Perhaps most damaging were Andrew's claims about how Charles had handled the situation with Prince Harry. According to Andrew, the king had made disparaging comments about his younger son's mental health and had shown no interest in repairing their relationship. Andrew also alleged that Charles had instructed palace staff to monitor Camilla's phone calls and limit her contact with friends and family members who were not approved by royal security. The interview concluded with Andrew making a direct appeal to the British public to consider what kind of monarchy they wanted to support. "The man who is now king has shown my family no mercy and no consideration for the pain he's causing," Andrew declared. "If he can treat people he's known for decades with such cruelty, what does that say about his fitness to serve as head of state?" The broadcast generated immediate and intense media coverage, with royal correspondents struggling to analyze the implications of such a direct public attack on the king's character. Public opinion polls conducted in the days following the interview showed a significant division among British citizens, with roughly equal numbers expressing support for Charles's position and sympathy for Andrew's grievances. For Charles, the interview confirmed his belief that Andrew Parker Bowles represented an existential threat to the stability and reputation of the monarchy. The king's response to the broadcast would be swift, comprehensive, and designed to ensure that no one would ever again consider challenging royal authority in such a public manner. The final phase of Charles's campaign against the Parker Bowles family was about to begin, and it would demonstrate the full extent of the power and resources available to a determined monarch. The silence that had begun with a simple family meeting was about to become a deafening roar that would echo throughout British society and permanently alter the landscape of royal relationships. As Thursday night ended and Friday morning dawned, both Charles and Andrew Parker Bowles understood that they had passed the point of no return. The conflict that had begun with a book proposal had evolved into a test of wills that would determine not only the fate of the Parker Bowles family, but also the future character of the British monarchy. The king had committed himself to a course of action that would either establish his authority definitively or damage his reputation irreparably. Camilla, caught between her loyalty to her husband and her love for her family, could only watch as the two most important relationships in her life were destroyed by forces that seemed completely beyond her control. The woman who had once believed that patience and understanding could overcome any obstacle was about to learn that sometimes the price of wearing a crown was higher than anyone could have imagined. Friday morning brought with it a series of events that would later be studied by historians as a masterclass in the application of institutional power. Charles had spent the night after Andrew's television interview in what his staff described as a state of focused calculation, and by dawn he had finalized plans for a response that would demonstrate the full extent of the monarchy's reach and influence within British society. The king's strategy unfolded across multiple fronts simultaneously, coordinated with a precision that revealed the sophisticated intelligence and communication networks available to the royal household. Each element of the campaign was designed to achieve maximum impact, while maintaining the appearance of natural consequences rather than deliberate retaliation. The first blow fell within hours of the morning's routine business opening. Andrew Parker Bowles received a formal notification from the Ministry of Defense that his military pension was being reviewed due to questions about conduct unbecoming a former officer. The letter, delivered by special courier, cited Andrew's public statements about his former colleagues and superiors as potentially violating the terms of his retirement agreement. While the review process would likely take months to complete, the immediate effect was to freeze Andrew's monthly pension payments pending the outcome of the investigation. Simultaneously, Andrew discovered that his membership in several prestigious London clubs had been temporarily suspended pending review by their respective governing boards. These institutions, which had provided Andrew with both social status and business networking opportunities for decades, had apparently received communications from influential members expressing concern about the appropriateness of maintaining someone who had publicly criticized the head of state. The speed and coordination of these actions made it clear that they were not spontaneous reactions, but part of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Perhaps most devastating was the impact on Andrew's business interests. As a retired military officer, he had built a modest consulting practice advising security firms and defense contractors on matters related to government procurement and military protocol. By noon on Friday, 3 of his major clients had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about potential conflicts of interest and reputational risks associated with their consultants' public disputes with the royal family. The palace's campaign against Andrew was remarkable not only for its comprehensiveness, but also for its deniability. Each action against him appeared to be the independent decision of separate institutions responding to legitimate concerns about professional conduct and public propriety. Charles had managed to orchestrate a systematic dismantling of Andrew's social and financial foundation while maintaining complete separation between the royal household and the specific actions being taken. Tom and Laura Parker Bowles were not spared from the expanding campaign of isolation. Both siblings discovered that their professional networks were being quietly influenced by the same forces that were targeting their father. Tom's restaurant consulting projects began to disappear as potential clients decided to avoid any association with the Parker Bowles name. Laura found that several wealthy collectors who had previously supported her gallery were suddenly unavailable for meetings and unreachable through their usual channels. The impact extended to their personal relationships as well. Friends who had maintained close connections with Tom and Laura for years began declining invitations to social events and offering vague excuses for their sudden unavailability. The siblings gradually realized that they had become social pariahs within the circles they had previously considered their natural community. Most painfully, both Tom and Laura discovered that their children were being affected by the campaign against their family. Tom's teenage daughter was quietly asked to step down from her position as head girl at her exclusive private school, with administrators citing concerns about distractions that might interfere with her academic responsibilities. Laura's son found that his application to join the school cricket team had been rejected despite his obvious athletic ability, with coaches providing only perfunctory explanations about team chemistry and commitment requirements. The systematic nature of these seemingly unrelated incidents gradually became clear to the Parker Bowles family, but they found themselves powerless to respond effectively. Any public complaints about their treatment would only confirm Andrew's allegations about the king's vindictive nature while providing additional material for media coverage that Charles could characterize as further evidence of the family's unreliability and poor judgment. Camilla observed the escalating campaign against her family with growing horror and helplessness. Her attempts to discuss the situation with Charles were gently but firmly redirected toward other topics, and she began to understand that her husband considered the matter closed to further debate. The king's position was that Andrew had chosen to make their dispute public, and the consequences of that decision were both inevitable and necessary for the protection of the monarchy. The queen consort's emotional state became increasingly fragile as she watched her children and grandchildren suffer for crimes they had not committed. Her private secretary reported that Camilla was having difficulty maintaining her composure during official engagements and was requesting modifications to her schedule that would minimize public appearances requiring extended periods of interaction with crowds or media representatives. The isolation was particularly difficult for Camilla because it prevented her from providing any support or comfort to her family during their time of crisis. The palace's security protocols now classified any communication between the queen consort and the Parker Bowles family as requiring advance approval and monitoring, effectively severing the informal channels of contact that had previously allowed her to maintain normal family relationships. Meanwhile, Andrew's attempts to fight back against the campaign targeting his family only served to escalate the conflict further. His decision to hire a public relations firm to help manage media coverage of his situation backfired when the firm's other clients began expressing concerns about potential conflicts of interest. The public relations company ultimately terminated their contract with Andrew, citing irreconcilable differences about strategy and approach. Andrew's efforts to generate sympathy for his family's plight through additional media appearances had the opposite effect of what he intended. Rather than portraying himself as a victim of royal vindictiveness, his increasingly desperate tone and wild accusations about palace conspiracies made him appear unstable and unreliable. Media commentators began questioning his credibility and suggesting that his claims about the royal family might be motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine grievances. The coup de grace in Charles's campaign came when Andrew's publisher suddenly announced that they were withdrawing their offer to publish his memoir. The official explanation cited concerns about legal liability and questions about the accuracy of some of Andrew's claims, but industry insiders understood that the decision was actually based on pressure from influential board members and major shareholders who had close ties to the royal establishment. Without a publishing contract, Andrew found himself in the position of having sacrificed his family's relationship with the royal household for a book that would never see print. The financial advance he had been counting on to support his legal and living expenses was no longer available, and his prospects for finding another publisher willing to take on the project had been effectively eliminated by the campaign against him. The completeness of Andrew's defeat was stunning in its scope and efficiency. Within less than 2 weeks of his television interview, he had lost his pension, his club memberships, his business clients, his book contract, and his social standing within the circles that had defined his identity for decades. His children had been similarly isolated and punished, and his grandchildren were experiencing consequences that would likely affect their educational and social opportunities for years to come. For Charles, the systematic destruction of the Parker Bowles family served multiple strategic purposes beyond just punishing Andrew for his specific transgressions. The king was establishing precedents that would serve as warnings to anyone else who might consider challenging royal authority or exploiting their connections to the monarchy for personal gain. The message was clear. The crown possessed resources and influence that could destroy the lives of anyone who chose to oppose it. The campaign also demonstrated Charles's willingness to prioritize institutional interests over personal relationships, even when those relationships involved his wife's family. This sent a powerful signal to other members of the extended royal circle that sentiment and personal loyalty would not protect them from consequences if their actions were deemed harmful to the monarchy. Perhaps most importantly, the king had shown that he was prepared to accept significant personal and political costs in order to maintain royal dignity and authority. The public nature of the conflict with Andrew had generated negative media coverage and criticism of Charles's methods, but the king appeared to view these short-term costs as acceptable prices for establishing long-term deterrent effects. The success of the campaign against the Parker Bowles family marked a transformation in how Charles approached his role as monarch. Gone was the hesitant, conciliatory figure who had spent decades avoiding confrontation and seeking compromise. In his place had emerged a ruler who was willing to use the full power of his position to defend the institution he represented, regardless of the personal costs to himself or others. As the dust began to settle on the conflict, it became clear that Charles had achieved a decisive victory that would reshape expectations about royal power and accountability for generations to come. The Parker Bowles family had been effectively erased from royal circles, and their fate served as a stark reminder of what could happen to anyone who chose to challenge the crown. But the victory had come at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. Camilla's transformation from a warm, approachable figure to a more distant and formal presence was noticed by the British public and media commentators. The queen consort, who had once been praised for her ability to humanize the monarchy, was now seen as someone who had chosen duty over family, and this perception began to affect public opinion about both her character and her suitability for her role. The silence that had begun as a strategic response to a specific threat had evolved into something much more profound and lasting. The Parker Bowles family had been not just defeated but obliterated, and the methods used to achieve that obliteration had revealed aspects of royal power that most people preferred not to contemplate. As Charles prepared for the final phase of his campaign to establish new standards for royal relationships, he could take satisfaction in having demonstrated that challenges to his authority would be met with overwhelming and decisive force. The king had proven that the monarchy remained a formidable institution capable of protecting itself against any threat, regardless of its source or motivation. The cost of that demonstration would become clear only in the months and years that followed, as the British people began to grapple with the implications of having a monarch who was willing to destroy families in order to preserve royal dignity. The silence that had been imposed on the Parker Bowles clan was about to become a defining characteristic of Charles's reign, one that would influence how the monarchy was perceived and understood by future generations. 6 months after the systematic destruction of the Parker Bowles family, the full consequences of Charles's actions began to manifest in ways that no one had anticipated. The king had achieved his immediate objective of neutralizing the threat posed by Andrew's book and establishing his authority as an uncompromising defender of royal dignity. However, the methods he had employed and the thoroughness of his victory had created new challenges that would prove far more complex and enduring than the original problem he had sought to solve. The most visible change was in Camilla herself. The woman who had once been celebrated for bringing warmth and accessibility to the monarchy had become a figure of tragic dignity, moving through her royal duties with a mechanical precision that suggested profound personal loss. Royal correspondents noted that her famous laugh had virtually disappeared from public events, replaced by polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The queen consort, who had once stopped to chat informally with members of the public, now maintained careful distances and formal protocols that created barriers between herself and the people she was supposed to serve. Close observers of the royal household reported that Camilla's private behavior had changed even more dramatically than her public persona. Staff members described her as spending long hours alone in her study, often writing in journals that she kept locked away from everyone, including her husband. She had begun declining social invitations that were not directly related to her official duties, and her circle of personal friends had shrunk to a small group of individuals who had demonstrated absolute loyalty to the royal family. The isolation appeared to be taking a significant toll on Camilla's health. Royal physicians expressed private concerns about her weight loss and reported difficulty sleeping, but their recommendations for rest and stress reduction were consistently overridden by the demands of her official schedule. The queen consort had become trapped in a cycle where her royal duties provided the only distraction from her personal pain, but the constant public appearances also served as painful reminders of what she had sacrificed to maintain her position. Perhaps most tragically, Camilla's relationship with her grandchildren had been completely severed. Tom's daughter and Laura's son, who had once spent school holidays and weekends at royal residences, were now forbidden from any contact with their grandmother. Palace security protocols classified them as potential security risks due to their father's and mother's compromised status, and any attempt at communication would be treated as a breach of the protective measures established for the queen consort's safety. The broader impact of Charles's campaign against the Parker Bowles family had begun to reverberate throughout British society in ways that surprised even the king's most experienced advisors. The systematic and ruthless nature of the royal response had sent shockwaves through the aristocratic and upper-middle-class circles that traditionally provided support and legitimacy for the monarchy. Many longtime supporters of the royal family found themselves questioning whether they wanted to be associated with an institution capable of such vindictive behavior. Several prominent figures who had previously served as royal patrons or trustees of royal charities quietly distanced themselves from their positions, citing scheduling conflicts and other commitments that prevented them from continuing their service. While these departures were handled with diplomatic discretion, the cumulative effect was to diminish the network of influential supporters who had traditionally helped to maintain public support for the monarchy. The media coverage of the Parker Bowles affair had also evolved in ways that created ongoing challenges for the royal family's public image. Initial reporting had focused primarily on Andrew's allegations and the palace's responses, but as the extent of the campaign against his family became apparent, journalists began investigating the broader implications of royal power and its potential for abuse. Investigative reporters discovered that the palace's influence extended far beyond what most people had realized, encompassing networks of financial, social, and political connections that could be mobilized to pressure individuals and institutions throughout British society. While none of these revelations involved illegal activities, they painted a picture of the monarchy as an institution with the capacity to manipulate and control aspects of British life that were supposedly independent of royal influence. Public opinion polls reflected the growing unease about the monarchy's methods and motivations. While Charles continued to receive majority support in his role as king, the margins had narrowed significantly, and younger respondents expressed particularly strong concerns about the concentration of unaccountable power within the royal establishment. The Parker Bowles affair had served as a wake-up call for many British citizens who had never previously considered the potential dangers of having an unelected head of state with access to such extensive resources and influence. International reactions to the events surrounding the Parker Bowles family had been similarly troubling for the royal household. European monarchies that had traditionally maintained close relationships with the British royal family began expressing private concerns about Charles's methods and their implications for the reputation of constitutional monarchy more broadly. Several foreign royal households discreetly reduced their level of engagement with British royal events, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were diplomatic excuses. The Commonwealth realms presented an even more serious challenge for Charles's international standing. Prime ministers and governors-general who served as the king's representatives in these countries had begun receiving questions from their parliaments and media about the appropriateness of maintaining constitutional ties with a monarch who had demonstrated such ruthless treatment of his own family members. While no country had yet initiated formal discussions about severing royal ties, the foundation of support that had previously been taken for granted was clearly beginning to erode. Within the royal family itself, the Parker Bowles affair had created tensions and divisions that threatened to undermine the unity that Charles had sought to protect. Prince William and Catherine had maintained public silence about their father's actions, but private sources suggested that they had serious concerns about the precedents being established and the potential implications for their own relationships with extended family members and friends. The relationship between Charles and his younger son Harry had been further damaged by revelations about the king's role in the systematic campaign against the Parker Bowles family. Harry's public statements about his own treatment by the royal establishment gained new credibility in light of what had happened to Camilla's family, and his claims about institutional vindictiveness and lack of accountability were now supported by documented evidence of the monarchy's capacity for retaliation. Perhaps most significantly, the Parker Bowles affair had fundamentally altered the relationship between Charles and Camilla in ways that neither of them had anticipated. While the Queen Consort had publicly supported her husband's decisions and had never criticized his actions, the emotional cost of losing her family had created a distance between them that was apparent to everyone who interacted with them regularly. Palace staff reported that Charles and Camilla now maintained separate social schedules whenever possible, and their private conversations had become limited to discussions of official business and necessary coordination of their public appearances. The easy affection and companionship that had characterized their relationship for decades had been replaced by a formal courtesy that suggested profound underlying tensions. Charles himself appeared to be struggling with the long-term consequences of his victory over the Parker Bowles family. While he had successfully established his authority and eliminated the immediate threat to royal dignity, the king seemed to be developing doubts about whether the costs had been justified by the results. Close advisors reported that he had become more withdrawn and less inclined to seek input from others when making important decisions, suggesting that the isolation he had imposed on others was beginning to affect his own psychological state. The systematic nature of the campaign against Andrew Parker Bowles and his family had required Charles to mobilize resources and employ methods that had revealed disturbing aspects of royal power even to the king himself. The ease with which he had been able to destroy the lives and livelihoods of people who had once been welcomed into his circle had demonstrated that the monarchy possessed capabilities that were fundamentally incompatible with democratic values and constitutional limitations. As the first anniversary of the initial confrontation with Tom and Laura Parker Bowles approached, it became clear that the silence Charles had imposed on Camilla's family had become a defining characteristic of his reign. The king who had once promised to modernize and humanize the monarchy had instead created an institution that was more distant, more threatening, and more isolated from British society than it had been in generations. The Parker Bowles family had disappeared entirely from public life, their social and professional destruction serving as a permanent warning to anyone who might consider challenging royal authority. Andrew's book would never be published. His television interview had been largely forgotten by the general public, and his family had been effectively erased from the circles they had once inhabited. But the victory had come at a price that was still being calculated. Camilla's transformation from a beloved public figure to a tragic symbol of royal duty had diminished the monarchy's appeal to ordinary citizens who had once seen her as a relatable human face on an ancient institution. The methods employed to achieve the Parker Bowles family's destruction had revealed aspects of royal power that most people preferred not to acknowledge, creating uncomfortable questions about the compatibility of monarchy with modern democratic values. The silence that had begun as a tactical response to a specific threat had evolved into something much more fundamental, a new understanding of the monarchy as an institution that would tolerate no dissent, accept no challenges, and show no mercy to those who dared to oppose it. Charles had succeeded in protecting the dignity of the crown, but in doing so he had created a legacy that would define his reign and influence how the monarchy was perceived for generations to come. As the king prepared for the second year of his reign, he could take satisfaction in having established his authority beyond any possible challenge. No one would ever again doubt the consequences of crossing the royal family or exploiting their connections to the monarchy for personal gain. The Parker Bowles affair had served its purpose as a deterrent and warning to potential troublemakers. But the cost of that demonstration had been higher than anyone had anticipated. The silence that now surrounded the monarchy was not just the absence of the Parker Bowles family's voices. It was the sound of a nation beginning to question whether the institution of kingship was compatible with the values and principles that British society claimed to represent. The crown that Charles wore had been secured through the systematic destruction of a family that had once been welcomed into the royal circle. The silence that he had imposed would echo through the remainder of his reign, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid to maintain royal dignity, and the questions that would never be fully answered about the true nature of power in modern Britain. In the end, Charles had gotten exactly what he wanted, a monarchy that commanded absolute respect and faced no challenges to its authority. But the silence that surrounded that achievement would prove to be more deafening than any criticism or opposition he had ever faced, and the isolation he had imposed on others would ultimately become his own eternal companion on the throne.